field guardian.
Do you remember the last time you transferred weapons from one Destiny 2 character to another? Wait, you remember the last time you transferred weapons from one Destiny 2 character to another, the intended in-game way? How about the last time you used the vault in general? Like, the physical vault. And the tower. This thing. Maybe? Probably not. I used it recently, actually. I marked a bunch of items for deletion using dim, and then I went into my vault to delete them. This video is about dim.
Hey, Grizz! You're not doing anything constructive!
Record a 20-minute video about Destiny 2 inventory management? You got it, Uncle Lewis. By now, everyone who plays Destiny more than a few hours a week has probably heard of dim. Most of you watching probably use it at least once per Destiny session, and for many, including me, launching Destiny is inseparable from opening your browser on a second screen or device. Because if you have a lot of gear, and especially if you have at least one alt, dim is irreplaceable. It's the only sensible way to manage your inventory. You basically have to use it. And probably everyone has grown accustomed to this by now, but it's at least a little weird that functionality which is all but required for our sanity is solely available through a player-created website. Now that's not to diminish dim or what it does. It's a fantastic tool, and I'm grateful to the developers of dim and those of the Bungie.net API that make dim possible. Truly, we'd be lost without all of them. But our ubiquitous reliance on dim says to me that something is missing from Destiny itself, and not just an additional dedicated menu for the vault and for checking alt characters. Because although that would be nice, really it just moved the bandage from one place to another. Instead, I'm interested in what the underlying problem is that makes dim necessary, that makes all this inventory management necessary, and what solving that problem would look like. Because the best inventory management system isn't the one that's easy to use, it's the one that you barely have to use at all. Part 1. Why do we rely on dim? So alright, even though most everyone that's going to watch this will already be intimately familiar with dim, it's still worthwhile to at least establish a baseline before we dig in. So let's start by laying down dim's core functionality. View and review all gear and items across the vault and all characters. Move items between our vault and characters in real time. Pull items from the postmaster. Search and filter gear by name or characteristic. Dim has some additional uses, such as reviewing pursuit progress and checking vendor inventories, but mostly those fall into the nice-to-have category, I think, whereas these are the purpose for the tool, especially the first two. It is called Destiny Item Manager, after all. Okay, now, why does dim do these things? Why does it exist in the first place? Let's cut to the punchline because there's enough video already as it is. Dim exists because the functionality it provides is regularly needed, and performing those actions in-game requires abandoning activities. If you want to pull an item from your vault, you have to stop what you're doing and load it into the tower, then load back into the activity. If you want to transfer a weapon from one character to another, you have to stop what you're doing and switch to that character, then go to the tower to vault the weapon, then switch back to the first character, then go to the tower again to retrieve it, then load back into the activity. If you want to pull an item from the postmaster, you have to stop. Okay, you get it. Dim allows you to do all of these things without stopping. You can be in an activity and transfer any item to yourself from the vault or postmaster or any alt character from right where you're standing, in seconds. In contrast, doing this stuff in game can take minutes. Imagine briefly a Destiny without dim. You're in a raid. You get to the last encounter. Time to break out the 150 RPM grenade launchers. Hey, Titan Slayer 92, you have a swarm with spikes? Yeah, it must be on my other character though, can you guys wait for me? Your fire team, maybe your friends, maybe an LFG, then has to wait for something like 5 minutes for you to transfer the gun over and rejoin the group. And these kids have really bad New York accents, so you know they don't fuck around. With dim, you drive the gun over, you're done. This is a wild disparity. How did we get here? Once upon a time, these situations might have been pretty uncommon, and they likely still are for maybe even the majority of players. John Destiny doesn't have more than one character, and mostly plays match-made and solo activities, and that's fine. There are two main reasons I think why the situation changed for those who play more than casually though. The first is that we have accumulated a lot of gear after playing the game for so long. There are lots of weapons we want for lots of different activities and objectives, and even more that we simply enjoy using. If we didn't have much stuff, or if it never really mattered what we used, then we wouldn't have to swap as often. Destiny is all about the gear. Use the right weapon for the right task. Use the right armor to buff the right ability for the right task. The more we play, the more we curate specific equipment for specific situations, all the while amassing additional gear that maybe we just enjoy casually. All these gear pools are only growing, which isn't a bad thing, but the second reason is that, relative to all this gear we've acquired, our in-field inventory is very limited. Or at least, because of the way our inventory is managed right now, it feels limited. Every gear slot has 10 spaces. This sounds like it should be enough, and it's probably the case that most players could whittle each slot down to the 10 items they use most often and only have to switch out infrequently. In practice though, we don't really have 10 slots, because there is a constant rotation of new gear passing through them from pickups and rewards. Anything new we receive goes into any empty spaces we may have. And I think this might be the true root of everything, the problem from which all other problems stem. We do not have control of our inventory. However many slots we leave free for new gear, they will eventually be filled by new gear. And once those slots are filled, the postmaster soon follows. There is no solution. There is only continuous and endless inventory management. This is a very real problem since Forsaken, which exacerbated our inventory woes dramatically with the introduction of armor perks and random rolls, each making the decision of keeping or dismantling gear more involved than simply, I already have this, as was the case in Year 1. It also moved the problem from the tower to the field by making world drops and activity rewards auto-decrypt directly into our gear slots, rather than staying put in their own inventory space until we get to Rahul. This is notable. We'll come back to this. This is why we use Dim, because it provides a reach across our collective inventories at all times. It keeps us playing the game more and managing our inventories less, and that's what the true solution must also provide. More Destiny playing, less Destiny item management. Destiny is a loot-centric game, so checking items is basically the name of the game. But if it's in the name, it should be enjoyable to do, or should at least not be so arduous as to require an external tool for efficiency. We play the game for the gear, but the gear shouldn't keep us from playing the game. So where do we start? Again, the functionality of Dim could be built into the game via some additional menus, and this might get us halfway to the solution, but simply moving the mechanics of the tool in-game wouldn't reduce our dependency on them. You'd still be performing the same actions with the same frequency, and honestly, Dim might still be better at it anyway. Instead, I think fixing the problem starts with our 10 gear slots. Part 2. Controlling our inventory. There are two types of gear in Destiny, the gear we use and the gear we acquire, and they have very different value semantics to the player. The gear we use represents real value. They're the items we know are good and enjoy using and therefore want to keep with us. This is your masterwork gear, your exotics, your god rolls, and the latest meta. It's the gear you farmed and the gear you tailored for your fashion. You'd keep it all with you if you could. In contrast to this, the gear we acquire represents potential value. It's the reason we play the game. It's excitement. It's that new drop you can't wait to check. It's the chance that maybe this is going to be the one. And that's invaluable to the player experience, but that doesn't mean each new item itself has value to the player. More often than not, they don't, and we dismantle them. These different classes of items shouldn't occupy the same space, not when there's only 10 slots to share between them, and especially not when they're twice as often being filled by actual garbage. Instead, our gear slots should only be filled by items we put there, and new items should go somewhere else. Where should they go? I'll come back to that later. First, let's talk about some of the exciting things that happen when we completely control our 10 gear slots. First, no more anxiety about our slots filling up. Nothing else is ever going to try to wedge in and get kicked to the postmaster. Everything that's in your 10 slots are the only things that will ever be there. This may not affect everyone equally. Probably those of us somewhere on the OCD spectrum will feel this harder. But everyone can at least relate to the frustration of getting a drop that you want to check, but whoops, you had a couple of blues you didn't dismantle and now the new thing has gone to the tower. Your gear slots are just your gear slots now. Second, we can use all 10 slots. For some of us, that's like 3 more slots to use. My inventory anxiety is a function of how full any given gear space is getting. 3 slots and I'm feeling okay. 2 slots puts me on edge. 1 slot, and I'm seriously not cool. We don't talk about 0 slots. I have never intentionally filled all 10 inventory slots of a gear space. Forcing everything to Postmaster is the Wild West of Destiny inventory management. And I'm sure there are some cowboys out there on that frontier, but it's not for me. Thankfully, when new gear doesn't get dropped into our free spaces any longer, the West will finally be tame enough for everyone. Lastly, there's no reason to not use all 10 slots. This is where it starts to really get fun. Those empty slots are meaningless now, both functionally and visually. So let's give them some new purpose. Instead of just sitting there and being empty, there could be some UI to encourage players to fill it. An empty slot could be a window into the vault with something as simple as a plus indicator to say, "Interact with me to fill this slot," and selecting it would bring up the vault. But not everything in the vault. No. Now we have context. If you're trying to fill a kinetic weapon slot, you'd only be shown kinetic weapons, and the same would be true for all slots. The interaction of filling any empty space would show you only a slice of your vault, just the items that are relevant. And when you're filling a weapon slot, the view could include the gear currently in those inventories on any other characters you have. A quick action could swap all of weapons between characters. Don't have any empty slots? A new exchange input on an item could bring up the same menu. A different input could send an item you don't want straight to the vault, emptying the space. Okay, quick note. I'm not a designer, and these mockups are not intended to convey the actual UI of the interactions, just the function of them. I'm sure we can all imagine this looking much more natural. While the concept of a physical vault in a video game that's otherwise super sci-fi and magical is sort of grounding in a whimsical way, it doesn't really make any sense when you consider how many things are transmatted around in front of us all the time, including ourselves. Far worse, it makes it frustrating to leverage the vault's functionality, which would be integral if it weren't so arduous. We don't need to go to a specific machine or vendor to get to our collections. We shouldn't have to for the vault either. It should be available to us wherever we are, just like DIM allows. Now back to the part I left out. Where is all of our new gear going to go? The shard pile? Well, yes, but no. Death of a postman. The postmaster has really already solved this problem. The gear we miss or can't collect all funnels here, and it allows us to review everything at once, side by side, not segregated across gear slots. There's 2 big problems with the current postmaster though. Its limited space and its physical location in the tower. But there's another inventory that behaves similarly to the postmaster, and which has lost some of its purpose in the recent game. Encrypted engrams. Before Forsaken, engrams stayed engrams when you picked them up. You had to take them to Rahul in the tower to decrypt them, which is when the item finally dropped into one of your gear slots. Put another way, we used to have a dedicated new gear inventory, and it was removed. There are various reasons why this was changed, and they aren't bad reasons, but it had consequences. Now, when you get a reward or a drop, it immediately tries to fill one of your gear slots, and when it can't, it goes to the postmaster. Effectively, when we gained the ability to skip the tower to get our gear, we lost an entire inventory space, forcing the remaining 2 spaces to pick up the slack. The engram inventory still exists, but it only collects engrams which do not auto-decrypt. And since Forsaken, those are only prime engrams and Eververse engrams, which means that it's very rarely ever accruing more than 4 or 5 engrams before a trip back to the tower. If they do fill up, new ones end up at the postmaster like everything else. This inventory doesn't serve much of a purpose any longer. At most, it's a reminder of things you have to turn in. The 2 specific things it holds. Things that just show up in the respective vendors' menus when you get to them anyway. Let's take it over. Let's shove the postmaster into it. The engrams feed is now the feed for all newly acquired gear. Any engram that auto-decrypts goes right into this inventory. You can hover over and inspect gear in this space just like in your equipment slots. Review them and decide what's worth keeping and what's trash. Dismantle items the same as always. But we've also got new vault and inter-character interactions now. Want to send one of the new items to the vault? You can do that with a single input now. No tower trip, no dim. Just press a button and that drop you just got is out of your hair, but not out of your life. Want to use a piece of gear right now? Just click it. It'll go into the inventory slot the same way it drops in today. If it won't fit, you'll get the same red flash you see today when you try to pull something from your vault that won't fit. Swap to your gear screen and vault something to make room. Now, 10 spaces of course isn't enough. We get too much gear too quickly. Even if segregating the new gear into its own location makes it easier to manage, it doesn't mean we're going to manage it just as often. The entire purpose of this exercise was to manage it less. The new engram feed should have at least as much space as the postmaster does now. Making it paginated in the same way that other inventories are will do it. We could get 30 slots that way without much input pain, since it will be sorted by newest by default. Speaking of sorting, organizing by rarity to put those blues together for a mass dismantle will be possible now too. Organize by type and by power level. If you can do it in your vault, you can do it here. There should rarely be a need to even click to another page. Sidebar. I haven't addressed it directly yet, but one of the most frustrating aspects of reviewing new gear is simply discerning what's new from what you put there yourself. A piece of gear shimmers when it's new, but that stops as soon as you hover over it to inspect it. If you don't deal with the item then, next time you come back, picking it out of the lineup will actually require a bit of brainpower. This is typically an armor problem and not a weapon problem. You rarely carry duplicate weapons around, but duplicate armor is natural when you try to have a good mix of perks with you. So when you have a buildup of new armor that looks the same as your curated armor, figuring out what's what becomes necessary. New engram feed makes this a non-issue. Nothing gets mixed in with your current gear. No need to distinguish yourself. This may sound like a minor thing to point out, but it's one of the little quality of life improvements that adds up to a nicer experience when it's there. You may never think about it, but you're not supposed to. The whole point of this inventory overhaul is to get you thinking about inventory management less. Sidebar, extended cut. Currently, the engram feed is a per character inventory, which makes perfect sense. Engrams aren't shared. However, gear is shared. I'm unsure whether it makes more sense to change the engram feed to a universal inventory where every character fills it up equally, or keep it character specific, preventing other characters from seeing or interacting with the other character's new gear, but essentially getting 3 times the space. Currently, postmasters aren't shared either, and since this new engram feed will also behave similar to the postmaster, my knee-jerk reaction is to stay in line with this. The problem is that this would add a new roadblock to the problem we're actively trying to solve. If you want a piece of gear that's in another character's new engram inventory, you have to swap characters or use dim. I don't think this would really be a problem, but regardless, my personal preference would be to have the engram feed stretch account-wide. As a player, new gear is just new gear until I make a decision about it, whether that decision is to keep it or shard it. From that perspective, new gear has no character identity. It's more of a task list for myself, the player. And just like when I look in dim and see unclaimed items in another character's postmaster and it makes me compulsively want to switch just to break down those 2 blues and take those 3 planetary materials that I desperately need, I would very much like it if I could keep ownership of my new gear regardless of what character I'm logged into. Filling up. Now there is one last thing that everyone will eventually have to think about, and there's really no way around it. What happens when this new gear inventory overflows? It'll happen, it has to. Adding 100 engram slots wouldn't prevent it, and that would just make management far worse. You want players to manage less, but you also want them to manage eventually. The trick is finding the right timing for that nudge. Not so often it's annoying, but not so infrequently that they amass too many items to reasonably sift through. I set the engram feed amount to 30. Katie isn't out of a job yet. When a player hits 30, additional engrams won't be collectible and will go to her, just like they do today. But I think a slightly better idea would be for them to go to Rahul instead. He is the Cryptarch after all, and he's kind of had his job stolen from him, what with all these newfangled auto-decrypting engrams. May as well give him an inventory to be filled. That way Katie only has to manage non-gear items. That way, it's even less likely that engrams will ever be lost. Part 3. Relaxed noises. Alright, that's about enough of all this. Let's review. Now we have control over our gear slots and can make use of all 10 of them without anxiety. Now we have a dedicated inventory to review our constant influx of new gear, with enough space to not worry about it for a while. Now we can play more Shoot, and play less Resident Evil 4 inventory management simulator. So how did Dim come out of this? Did we kill it? Let's see. View and review all gear and items across the vault and all characters. Yep, we can do this from the character screen now. Move items between our vault and characters in real time. Also manageable from the character screen now, while we're reviewing gear. Pull items from Postmaster. No, but thanks to the new engram feed, items going to Postmaster should be far less common. search and filter gear by name or characteristic. Well, this was never really an objective, but with vault slices and reordering, we may not have to rely on dim for this quite as much, and there will be opportunity for Bungie to easily add some additional filter options to these menus in the future. So the boxes got checked, but the objective wasn't just to tick dim boxes within the game. It was also to reduce the player reliance on those features in the first place, push back the length of time until the game nudges the player to manage their gear, and to make that management faster and less painful, regardless of when they choose to do it. It's also worth pointing out again here that one of our explicit objectives was to not just ham-fist the new menu into the game. The game has an excessive amount of menus as it is. It was important that these new features aren't simply dumped into a new vault screen next to the collection screen because, as I mentioned at the beginning, that wouldn't make it any better than using dim. It would likely be worse. So instead of this, what we did was allow for some new interactions within the character screen that naturally give us the features where they make sense. We can send and pull gear to and from the vault right from the gear slots themselves. Same for weapons on other characters. We also repurposed an existing inventory space that was long in the tooth. Effectively, we overhauled inventory management without any new functionality, and the only thing we functionally changed was returning new gear to its own inventory, this time without requiring decryption. Everything else was achieved by making connections between systems that already existed but were previously disconnected. Okay, I know I probably sound super high on my own horse at this point, but I'm not so arrogant as to think this is the only or best solution. Bungie may already be cooking something up that's even better. I have to believe they're at least thinking about it. Also, I'm a software developer, not a UX or game designer, so even professionally, I'm disconnected from the expertise required to actually make informed criticisms of these kinds of systems. But I do think these changes could go a long way to improving quality of life when it comes to the game's inventory management. I actually wrote this up months ago and never shared it, but ever since I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. Every time I've had that pang of anxiety when one of my inventory slots starts getting full, and every time I've amassed a collection of new gear that is probably all trash, but I just don't want to commit to dealing with it yet. So about every 30 minutes or so of playing Destiny, I've wanted this change. I would be ecstatic to see any solution to these problems implemented into the game. This video was more about exposure of the topic and discussion to that end than it was putting one solution on a pedestal, so hopefully it does that.